He cheated on me for 15 years, looked me in the eye, and called me my dearest. And then I ruined his life the way he ruined mine. Stay with me until the very end to find out how the story ends. I look forward to your comments and thoughts on the story. For 15 years, I believed I was loved. Every morning, I'd wake up next to him, his hand draped over my waist, his breath soft against my neck, and I'd think, this is safety. He'd kiss my forehead, tuck a strand of hair behind my ear and say, "You're my home, the only one who ever truly knew me." I believed him. Every word, every look, every lie. We built a life together, or at least I thought we did. A modest home, 2 kids, shared birthdays, anniversaries filled with handwritten notes and secondhand jewelry that I cherished as if they were diamonds. I never asked for more than his time, his love, his presence, and I thought I had it all. But lies don't stay buried forever. They rise, slowly at first, like steam from a cracked teapot, until the whistle is so loud you can't ignore it anymore. It started with a scent. One evening, he came home late from work, and there was perfume clinging to his shirt. Not mine. I laughed, told him he must have hugged someone at the office. He smiled and agreed, just like that. No hesitation, no flicker of guilt. Then there were the late-night texts, the weekend conferences, the sudden need for privacy that never existed before. My stomach twisted every time I reached for his phone and saw it face down, screen silenced. But I still didn't look. I didn't want to find the truth, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And then I did see it. Her name was Lauren, blonde, 28. She sent him a picture in lingerie with the caption, "Miss you already." That's all it took. One picture, one message, and 15 years of illusion shattered like glass underfoot. He didn't even deny it, just stared at me with the same calm expression he'd always worn. "It didn't mean anything," he said. "She was just something different. Different. Like I was a worn-out book he'd read too many times, and she was a fresh new story." That night, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stood in the same kitchen where we'd once danced barefoot after too much wine, and I realized this man had destroyed me piece by piece with a smile on his face. And he would have kept doing it if I hadn't opened my eyes. But if he thought he could walk away unscarred, he was wrong. Because I had loved him fully, and now I would unlove him completely. And that, I promised myself, would change everything. The days that followed felt like walking through fog. I went to work. I smiled at neighbors. I cooked dinner for our children. And yet, inside, something had begun to rot, quietly, slowly, as if my soul was peeling itself away from the woman I used to be. He acted like nothing had changed, still kissed my cheek in the mornings, still sent me texts during the day with hearts and jokes and "I miss you." I answered, briefly, coldly. He didn't notice the difference, or maybe he pretended not to. Men like him are good at pretending, masters of illusion. But I stopped pretending. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of his breath. I memorized the sound of his snore, the way he turned in his sleep, the way his body always drifted closer to mine, like instinct. I used to love that. Now it made my skin crawl. He had touched her, kissed her with the same mouth he used to whisper to me, told her the same lies, maybe even sweeter ones. I wondered if he ever looked her in the eyes the way he looked at me, that deep, searching gaze that once felt sacred. Did he give her that too? I began noticing things I had once ignored. The way he dressed a little better before his meetings, The cologne I never bought him sitting on the bathroom shelf, the long showers, the sudden fitness obsession. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, and I had smiled through it for years, 15 years. That number haunted me, not just because of what he did, but because of what I let him do. I was angry at him, yes, but I was furious at myself. How could I have been so blind, so trusting? I wasn't naive. I was loyal, and he mistook that for weakness. But he was wrong, so very wrong. I started writing things down. Every lie I uncovered, every excuse he gave, every strange transaction on our credit card. I wasn't sure why at first. Maybe I wanted to understand the full weight of the betrayal, or maybe I was building something quietly, a path toward the end, brick by painful brick. He still called me his favorite person, still told our friends how lucky he was. I smiled politely, nodded when they praised our marriage. Let them believe the lie a little longer, because I wasn't going to shout. I was going to whisper. And then I was going to watch it all burn. They say some betrayals come like thunder, sudden, loud, unforgettable. His wasn't thunder. It was erosion. 15 years of quiet damage, hidden cracks spreading beneath the surface until everything crumbled with one message, one photo, one whispered, "It didn't mean anything." But it meant everything. He still came home at 6, still kissed my forehead, still sat at the dinner table and asked about my day. It amazed me, the ease with which he carried on as if nothing had happened. As if the lie was so deeply woven into his skin, he no longer felt its weight. I began to match his performance. Every morning, I handed him coffee with a smile. Every evening, I kissed him back. But inside, I was collecting pieces, small truths he'd overlooked, evidence he thought I'd never find, receipts tucked into pockets, strange phone numbers, a second email account. I found the second apartment 2 towns over by accident, or fate, a lease in his name, paid in cash. He was living a second life, and I was done living in his shadow. I started therapy. He thought it was for anxiety, for self-care. In a way, it was, but not in the way he assumed. I needed to remember who I was before him. The woman who laughed loudly, who traveled alone, who didn't shrink to make someone else feel big. That woman had not disappeared. She was waking up. One night, I followed him, said I was heading to book club. Instead, I waited outside the office he claimed to be working late in. He never showed. I trailed his car to a little red brick house with white shutters. Lights flicked on. A shadow moved in the upstairs window. I stayed until the lights went out, until I was sure. It wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a choice. Repeated. Intentional. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I went home, poured a glass of wine, and wrote in my journal, "He's made his world. Let him live in it. I'm building mine." This wasn't about revenge. This was about truth. And he had no idea what was coming. The hardest part wasn't accepting the betrayal. It was pretending it hadn't broken me. I walked through my days like a ghost in my own life. Everything looked the same. The breakfast dishes, the folded laundry, the wedding photo still hanging on the wall. But I was different. I was watching now, learning, measuring every inch of his deception and quietly mapping my way out. Not out of the house, not yet. Out of the illusion. I made copies of everything, tax returns, bank statements, mortgage documents. I met with a lawyer, told her I was asking for a friend. She smiled kindly, slid me a business card and said, "When you're ready, come back. And this time, bring your name." I smiled back. That name? It was going to mean something again. He still called me sweetheart, still left notes on the kitchen counter. "I love you. Have a great day. Let's go away soon." I saved every one. Not because I believed him, but because I wanted to remember the quiet cruelty of those words, the ease with which he wrote them while his heart belonged to someone else. There was no remorse in his eyes, just routine. He'd cheated for 15 years. I was certain of it now, not just with Lauren, but others. The signs were too many, the lies too polished. He'd built a life on betrayal and wrapped it in ribbons, thinking I'd never dare untie them. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I created a separate account in my name only. I began putting away small amounts, groceries returned, refunds claimed, gifts I never bought. He didn't notice. He was too busy chasing someone new, mistaking her attention for affection, her body for devotion. He had no idea I was 2 steps ahead. Our daughter's college tuition? Paid through the account he didn't know existed. The home repairs he promised to get to someday? I handled them myself, quietly, efficiently. He was slipping out of the center of our lives, and he didn't even see it happening. Some women burned down houses. I was building one, brick by quiet brick, and when I finished, he would find himself standing in a home he no longer recognized because I would have erased every trace of the man he thought he was. Lauren was just one of them. She wasn't the beginning. She wasn't even the worst. She was simply the one who left a trace. The others had been smarter, or maybe I had been more blind. But now, with my eyes wide open, I saw every thread of his double life unraveling. Her lipstick was still on the wine glass he'd brought home from a client dinner, a smear of coral pink, not a color I ever wore. When I held the glass to the light, it caught the sun just enough to burn. That glass sat in our dishwasher for a week. I never touched it. Neither did he. He must have known I saw it, but still, he said nothing. We danced this strange dance of avoidance. Smiles over dinner, shallow conversations, plans that led nowhere. It felt like acting in a play we'd both forgotten the lines to. He didn't know that I wasn't just performing, I was documenting. Every moment, every gesture, every contradiction between his words and his actions. I wasn't gathering ammunition, I was gathering clarity. And with that clarity came distance. Emotional first, then physical. I stopped reaching for his hand, stopped asking how his day went. I spoke to him the way you speak to a stranger in an elevator, polite, brief, disinterested. He noticed, of course. One evening he asked, "Are we okay?" With that same fake concern he used when the internet went down or the soup burned. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "We're fine." It wasn't a lie. We were finally fine, because I wasn't lying to myself anymore. What surprised me was how easily he accepted that answer, how desperately he wanted to believe that nothing had changed, that I hadn't changed, but I had. Oh, how I had. He was so used to getting away with it, so used to my forgiveness before I even knew I was supposed to give it, that he couldn't imagine I might be quietly building something stronger than revenge. Freedom. Lauren didn't destroy our marriage. He did. And someday, when the mirror finally cracked for him, when the women grew tired, when the thrill faded, when his lies turned stale even to himself, he'd look around and realize I wasn't there anymore. Not in body, not in heart, not in memory. But I wouldn't be watching when it happened. I'd be gone. And he'd be standing in the ruins of a life he took for granted. There was a kind of power in saying nothing, in letting him speak, watching his mouth move as he spun lies wrapped in honey, while I nodded gently, sipping tea, cataloging every word. He thought silence meant surrender. But silence, I'd learned, could be the sharpest blade of all. He came home late again. Traffic, he said. I smiled and asked if the traffic wore perfume. He laughed like I was joking. And I laughed too, because the truth didn't need a scene anymore. It just needed space, time, patience. I had all three now. He'd become predictable. His rhythms, his excuses, the way he adjusted his tie before stepping out for a meeting he never used to have. I watched him age in slow motion, the lines deepening at the corners of his eyes, the confidence becoming performative, shaky. He was no longer building something, he was clinging to it. And I was learning to let go. Letting go of the woman who once waited by the window when he was late, letting go of the anxiety that used to flood my chest when he didn't answer his phone, letting go of the idea that I needed his approval to feel enough. He didn't know I'd changed the locks on our joint account, didn't notice that the passwords had shifted, that the insurance policy no longer named him as the primary. He wasn't paying attention anymore, not really. He never had. That was his mistake. One evening, he kissed my cheek on his way out and said, "I love you, don't wait up." And for the first time in years, I didn't feel pain. I felt freedom. That night, I opened the closet and started removing pieces of the life we'd built. Old photos, anniversary cards, that dried bouquet from our 10th year that I'd foolishly preserved. I filled a box, labeled it history. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble, because grief had already done its work. What remained now was resolve. He was sleeping beside a woman who no longer believed a word he said, and one day, soon, he'd learn what it felt like to be dismissed, quietly, thoroughly, without warning, just like I had been for 15 years. Only this time, the silence wouldn't mean forgiveness, it would mean goodbye. Our anniversary was on a Thursday that year. 15 years. Crystal, according to the traditions. Fitting, I thought. Fragile. Transparent. Sharp. He didn't remember. Not in the morning. Not in a passing comment. Not even in the way he normally did. With a rushed bouquet from the gas station and a dinner reservation made too late. Nothing. It came and went like any other day. Except I remembered. And I celebrated it quietly, in my own way. I took myself out to dinner. A small Italian place across town he never liked. Too loud, too authentic. I ordered the wine he used to mock, ate dessert before dinner, and smiled at strangers. The waiter asked if I was celebrating something. I said, freedom. He didn't ask more. He just nodded and brought another glass on the house. It was the best anniversary I'd had in years. When I came home, he was asleep on the couch, TV still flickering blue shadows over his face. His phone sat on the coffee table, lit up with a message preview. Miss you already. No name, no shame, just the usual script. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't wake him. I just stood there and looked at him, truly looked. At the man I once believed was my world, now just a stranger in familiar clothes. It stunned me how easy it was to feel nothing. I went upstairs, took a bath, let the water rise around me and imagined it washing away the 15 years of betrayal, the gaslighting, the false smiles, the whispered lies. I dried off, brushed my hair, and slipped into bed, alone, peacefully. He never asked where I'd been that night. He never even noticed I'd gone. And that's when I knew he'd already lost me. Not in one explosive moment, not in a fight or confession. He lost me in the silence, in the nights I sat beside him with a storm in my chest while he scrolled through someone else's photos. He lost me in every ignored question, every dismissive sigh, every careless, "I love you" spoken without looking. The end wasn't coming. It had already arrived. He just hadn't realized it yet. But he would, very soon. It happened one Sunday morning, the first time he noticed something was different. I was sitting by the window, sipping my coffee, flipping through the local newspaper like I always did. The same paper I used to read to fill the silence between us. But this time, I was genuinely reading, and not just passing time. I didn't look up when he entered the kitchen, didn't ask if he wanted breakfast, didn't fill the air with soft, obliging conversation like I used to. He stood there for a few seconds too long, then he asked, "You okay?" I turned to him, smiled gently, and said, "I'm perfect." And I was. He watched me for a moment, unsure. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, not guilt, not remorse, confusion. He couldn't understand why I wasn't circling around him like a planet anymore, why my gravity had shifted, why the air between us didn't beg for his attention. I went out that afternoon, said I was meeting a friend. I didn't explain who, he didn't ask, but I saw the way his brow furrowed, just a little, as I grabbed my keys. I wore lipstick, not for him, for me. I left the scent of confidence in the hallway, and when I returned hours later, he was still sitting in the living room, watching TV, pretending not to care. But he noticed. Men like him always notice the absence of something they never truly valued when it was there. Later that night, as we got ready for bed, he turned to me and asked, "Are we still good?" His voice was too casual, the tone carefully neutral. It almost made me laugh. After everything, after 15 years, now he wanted reassurance. I said, "We're fine." The same words I'd said before, but this time, I didn't look at him when I said it. I was brushing my hair, watching myself in the mirror. Not him, me. Because I was no longer speaking for his comfort. I was reminding myself who I was becoming. And even though he didn't know it yet, the shift had already begun. The distance he once created to hide his secrets had become the very space I needed to rediscover myself. He was losing his grip, and the irony was delicious. The more I pulled away, the more he tried to return to the version of himself I used to love. But it was too late. I didn't need that man anymore. I didn't need any man at all. There was something new in my reflection. I used to look in the mirror and search for her, the woman I used to be before him, the one with curiosity in her eyes and confidence in her spine. For years, she felt like a memory blurred by fog, a version of myself softened, quieted, reshaped to fit beside a man who only saw what he needed me to be. But now I was beginning to see her again. Not all at once, just in flashes. A steadier gaze, a straighter posture, a calmness that wasn't about peace with him, but peace with myself. I started wearing colors he never liked. Reds, deep greens, bold earrings that clinked when I moved. I wasn't dressing for attention. I was dressing like a woman who remembered who she was before she forgot herself in someone else's life. He noticed. "You look different lately," he said one morning, watching me from across the table. "Do I?" I replied, sipping my coffee. My tone was light, but my eyes didn't break from his. He blinked first. He tried harder after that. Small gestures, shallow apologies wrapped in new routines. He picked up groceries without being asked, called me babe more often, even brought home flowers once, as if a handful of store-bought lilies could rewind the years. But it wasn't kindness, it was fear. He sensed the shift, and he didn't like not being the center anymore. One evening I caught him staring at me, really staring, while I laughed at something on TV. It wasn't a moment meant for him. It wasn't a performance. It was just me, smiling for myself. And I think that scared him more than any argument ever could, because he was no longer part of my joy. He was only part of the history I had outgrown. I had spent so many years trying to make myself small enough to be loved by him. Now I was learning to take up space again, unapologetically. And every time I chose myself, I could feel the foundation he stood on cracking just a little more. I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't thrown him out. I hadn't screamed or exposed him to the world. But make no mistake, the quiet was never weakness. It was strategy. I used to explain everything: where I was going, why I was late, what I was thinking, how I was feeling. I softened every truth to fit inside his comfort. I bent myself around his moods, his expectations, his silences, but not anymore. One Saturday morning, he asked if I could cancel my plans, said he wanted us to spend the day together. I looked up from my book and said calmly, "I already made plans." I didn't offer details, I didn't ask permission, and I didn't feel guilty. His mouth opened like he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. He was used to a version of me that gave in before there was even conflict. The woman who'd change her schedule, her words, her needs, all to keep the peace. But that woman was gone. Later that afternoon, I went out, alone. I walked through the farmer's market, bought myself fresh flowers, lingered in a bookstore without checking the time. I had nowhere urgent to be. I wasn't rushing home to explain myself. I was simply existing. And I realized how much I had missed the quiet of my own company. When I returned, the house was quiet. He was in the kitchen, fiddling with something he didn't need to fix, clearly waiting to be noticed. I walked past him, humming a tune I hadn't heard in years, one I used to sing when I was younger, before love became labor. He followed me into the living room. "You've been different lately," he said. I looked at him. "No," I answered. "I've just stopped apologizing for who I am." He stared at me, searching for the softness I used to wrap around every word. It wasn't there. Not anymore. Because the truth was, I had spent 15 years explaining my worth to a man who never truly saw it. And I was done translating my love into language he refused to learn. The woman in me, the whole, flawed, extraordinary woman I was, deserved more than crumbs and compromise. He used to think silence meant he'd won, that I'd given up. But silence, I'd come to learn, could also mean evolution, and I wasn't explaining that either. It had been months since the name Lauren first entered my life, carved into my memory like a paper cut you forget until it stings again. But it wasn't her name that lingered. It was the idea of her, the women who came before her, the ones who'd come after, each one a symptom of a man who needed constant validation, who could look you in the eyes and lie without blinking. I saw her once, by accident. I was sitting at a cafe I'd recently come to love, sipping my coffee, journaling as I did most weekends now. She walked in wearing sunglasses and confidence, and he was with her. He didn't see me, not at first. They sat just 2 tables away. She laughed loudly, the kind of laugh that demanded attention, and he smiled like a schoolboy with a secret. For a moment, I stared, just long enough to feel the sting, and then something strange happened. I didn't feel rage, or humiliation, or grief. I felt pity, not for myself, for her. She was where I had once been, dazzled by charm, flattered by crumbs, unaware of the truth lying just beneath the polished surface. She didn't know that the same mouth calling her beautiful had whispered the same words to someone else hours, days, weeks before. I wondered how long it would take for her to notice the cracks. He turned his head, maybe catching a flicker of my presence. Our eyes met. I didn't look away. He froze, and for the first time in a very long time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not panic, not drama, just quiet, unsettled fear. Because in that moment, he realized something. I wasn't angry. I wasn't chasing. I wasn't broken. I was free. I smiled slowly and returned to my journal. My hands didn't shake. My breath was calm. He looked away first. She didn't notice. She was busy laughing, and I thought, enjoy it while it lasts, sweetheart, because someday she'd be sitting in this same place, or one like it, asking the same questions I once did. And by then, I'd be long gone, living a life no longer defined by him, or his habits, or the shadows he tried to pull me into. That day at the cafe wasn't an ambush. It was confirmation. He'd lost the only woman who ever stayed, and I had finally stopped staying for anyone but me. It was bound to happen. You can hide a lot from children. Late nights, distant dinners, fake smiles. But eventually, even they begin to see through the cracks. And when they do, their questions don't come gently. They come with sharp innocence, unfiltered, blunt. Our daughter asked first.
We were in the kitchen, baking cookies like we used to when she was little. Flour dusted the counters, music played in the background, and she looked up from the bowl and said, "Mom, are you and Dad okay?" I didn't flinch. I kept stirring. "Why do you ask?" She shrugged, but her eyes searched mine. "You're just different. You smile more when he's not around." That stayed with me for days. A week later, our son, older, quieter, pulled me aside while unloading groceries. "You don't talk to him anymore," he said. "You used to laugh with him. Now it's like you're just in the same room, not in the same life." And there it was, the truth from their mouths. No need for investigations, no dramatic discoveries. They knew, not the details, not the betrayals, but the shift, the absence of warmth, the space between us that had once been filled with love and was now just air. I didn't lie to them. I didn't say everything's fine. I said some things change, some things break, and sometimes love doesn't look like it used to. They nodded, quiet, thoughtful, and I realized then I hadn't failed them by staying. I wasn't failing them by planning to leave. I was showing them something important, that silence can speak, that dignity matters, and that strength isn't always loud. He started noticing the shift, too. The way the kids sided with me without realizing, the way they asked him fewer questions, the way they drifted closer to the truth he couldn't hide anymore. And I saw something new in him. Not anger, not defiance. Shame. Not for what he had done, but for the realization that, in losing me, he was slowly losing them too. Because love built on lies doesn't hold up under scrutiny, and children, even grown ones, can feel when loyalty has been misplaced. I wasn't asking them to choose, but they already had. For years, I had trained myself to sleep lightly, not because I was afraid of him, not physically, but because I was afraid of the silence, afraid of what I didn't know, of who he might be texting in the dark, of what excuses I'd be handed in the morning. My rest had become a form of vigilance, my dreams constantly interrupted by doubt. But one night, not long after seeing him with Lauren at the cafe, something shifted. It was a Tuesday, ordinary in every way. The kids were both home for dinner. Laughter floated through the house. He was unusually quiet, probably sensing that the world he once controlled was slipping through his fingers. He watched me move through the room like a stranger he used to know. That night, I climbed into bed before him. I didn't wait for the conversation. I didn't pretend to read or scroll or fill the air with forced small talk. I simply lay down, pulled the blanket over my shoulders, and let the silence wrap around me. Not as a threat, but as a shield. And for the first time in years, I fell asleep, deeply, fully, without listening for footsteps or the vibration of his phone, without wondering where he was going or who he was thinking about. I slept like someone who had finally stopped carrying a weight that was never hers to begin with. In the morning, I woke up before him. The sun streamed through the curtains, soft and golden. I sat up,
stretched, and realized something powerful. I felt rested, not just physically, but emotionally. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't scanning the room for lies. He stirred beside me, opened his eyes slowly, and blinked at me like I was some unfamiliar painting on a wall he'd walked past for years without really seeing. "You're up early," he said. "I slept well," I answered. He didn't know what to do with that, with a version of me that no longer needed to explain herself or wait for his rhythm to dictate hers. I could see it, the uncertainty behind his eyes, the worry that maybe, just maybe, he had lost his place in my world. And he had, because the moment I slept without fear was the moment I understood. Peace doesn't come when someone finally treats you right. Peace comes when you finally treat yourself that way. He wanted to host one of our old-fashioned dinner parties, something we hadn't done in years. "Just a few friends," he said, "like we used to." I nodded. I smiled. I agreed. I didn't do it for him. I did it because I wanted them to see. Our closest friends, the ones who had always looked at us like a model couple, the ones who said things like, "You're lucky to have him," and "He just adores you." I wanted them to witness the truth without me ever saying a word. The evening came. I cooked. I decorated. I wore a dress he never liked, deep blue, elegant, confident. He noticed. "You're dressing up?" he asked. "Shouldn't I?" I said. People arrived with wine and laughter, the house filled with voices and glasses clinking, just like old times. Except this time, I wasn't clinging to illusion. I was observing it. They watched us closely. Something had shifted. They could feel it. The smiles were too polite, the conversations too rehearsed. He reached for my hand once, and I didn't pull away, but I didn't hold on either. He kept telling the same stories, the ones he always used to get a laugh. But I watched as the charm began to wear thin. People weren't laughing as hard. Some glanced at me, unsure. Something about the performance had changed, and they could feel the strain. And when someone asked how long we'd been together, he said, 15 years, and smiled proudly. I smiled too, but not for the same reason. Because I knew those 15 years were built on more silence than honesty, more acting than loving, and now I was rewriting the script. At the end of the night, as guests filtered out, one friend, a quiet one, lingered behind. She gave me a long look, then said softly, "You okay?" I met her eyes. "I will be," I said. She nodded, hugged me tighter than usual, and left. He didn't ask what we talked about. Of course he didn't, because deep down, he knew. The cracks weren't just between us anymore. They had started to show on the surface, and soon everyone would see them. Not because I screamed, but because I finally stopped hiding. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no gasps of disbelief. It was a Tuesday. He came into the kitchen, phone in hand, already dressed in that polished, casual way he always wore when he wasn't going where he claimed to be going. "I thought we could drive up to the lake this weekend," he said. "Just the two of us, like old times." He smiled, practiced, safe. I looked up from my tea, calm as still water, and said, "No, just that. One word. Firm final. Number." For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me. He blinked, tilted his head like a confused child. "No, no," I repeated. "I have plans." And I did. Plans that didn't involve pretending. Plans that didn't require stuffing my heartbreak into a suitcase and driving somewhere with the man who gave it to me. I had plans to read, to walk, to be alone in my own thoughts without interruption or false reconciliation. He stood there, stunned by the simplicity of it. He wasn't used to hearing no from me, not without apology, not without softness. "You're really not coming?" he asked again, his voice quieter now. I shook my head. "You'll be fine," I said. He didn't know it yet, but I wasn't just saying no to the weekend. I was saying no to pretending we still had something to fix. No to his charm, his last-minute gestures, his empty traditions. No to being the woman who waited for him to change. No to the past. That evening, he barely spoke. I saw him scroll through his phone more than usual. I could feel the silence pressing against him, making him uncomfortable. But not me. I was learning to live in it, to draw strength from it. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming choice. And the first choice I made, the first real one in years, was to say no. Not in anger, in clarity, and that one word changed everything. There was a time I begged for his attention without ever speaking a word. A new dress worn for dinner, a fresh haircut, my favorite song playing low in the kitchen, all tiny invitations, hoping he'd see me, notice me, look at me the way he used to, before time and betrayal hardened everything between us. But he never noticed. He was always looking at someone else, something else, his phone, his reflection, his next excuse. Now I had stopped trying, and that's when he finally started to look. "You've changed," he said one evening, watching me as I folded laundry on the bed. "Yes," I said, no explanation, no denial. "You go out more. You seem distant." I almost laughed. It had taken him 15 years to feel what I'd felt all along, invisible. I looked at him and said calmly, "I'm not distant. I'm just no longer pretending we're close." He didn't know what to do with that truth, so he left the room. That night, as I moved through the house alone, I saw the trail of who I used to be. Photos on the wall of us smiling for others, notes I'd once left in his briefcase, dinners I cooked and set out on a table where I now often sat by myself. He never noticed how I made the bed with care every morning, even when I was angry. How I learned to love his favorite recipes just so he'd smile after a long day. How I kept our life stitched together while he unraveled it behind my back. But he noticed now, not the details, but the absence. Because absence, I've learned, is louder than presence when it follows years of being taken for granted. And he was beginning to understand that I wasn't just quieter these days. I was gone in every way that mattered. He missed the version of me who lived for his attention, but she had outgrown him. Now I noticed things instead, things that filled me. Books that made me feel alive, music I hadn't listened to in years, friends I'd pushed aside to hold on to a man who didn't know how to hold on to anything. I noticed me, and that was the beginning of everything he would never be able to undo. He came home early. No warning, no call. Just walked in the door and stood in the living room like someone who didn't quite belong there anymore. I was sitting on the couch, reading, wrapped in a blanket that had once been ours. Now it was mine. "We need to talk," he said, his voice lower than usual. I closed the book, marked my page. "All right," I said. He sat across from me, fidgeting with the ring on his finger, the one I hadn't looked at in weeks. He hesitated, searching for the right opening. I didn't help him. I didn't offer softness, not this time. "I know I haven't been the man you deserved," he began. I tilted my head. "Go on." "I made mistakes," he said, eyes on the floor now. "But we've been through so much. Don't you think that counts for something?" 15 years. Yes, we'd been through something. But what he called so much, I now saw as endurance, survival, me carrying a weight while he floated above it, unbothered, unburdened. "It counts," I said. "It counts as the reason I finally let go." He looked up, startled. "Let go of what?" "Of waiting," I answered. "Of hoping you'd change. Of pretending that love is the same thing as sacrifice." He blinked, visibly shaken. He had expected anger. He had expected a fight, maybe even tears. But calm? Calm was terrifying, because it meant I was certain. "So that's it?" he asked. "You're giving up?" "No," I said. "I gave up a long time ago. I just didn't tell you." The silence that followed was thick, not heavy with tension, but final. He realized then that the woman sitting in front of him was no longer reachable, not through guilt, not through charm, not through the dusty history he kept trying to polish into something worth saving. I stood up. "You don't have to leave tonight," I told him, "but eventually you will." He didn't argue, because somewhere deep inside, even he knew, he had already left me years ago. I was simply the last to follow. It was a quiet morning. The sky was overcast, and the house felt unusually still, like it was holding its breath. I had spent the last few weeks tying up loose ends, organizing documents, making copies of everything that mattered: bank records, insurance policies, the deed. I had been careful, strategic, calm. I placed the folder on the kitchen table. He came downstairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes, already distracted, already distant, as usual. He barely glanced at the table before pouring himself coffee. Then he saw it, a plain black folder. "What's this?" he asked. "Everything you need," I said, sitting across from him. "Your accounts, your belongings, your share." He opened it slowly. His eyes scanned the contents. A few pages in, I saw the shift. Confusion, disbelief, and then panic as it finally hit him. This wasn't a threat. This wasn't a warning. This was done. "You're serious," he said. "I've never been more," I replied. He leaned back, blinking rapidly. "You really planned all this without telling me?" I almost smiled. "You planned 15 years of betrayal without telling me. This felt fair." He tried to speak, to protest, to plead, but the words wouldn't come, because nothing he said could erase the quiet choices that had brought us here. Nothing could cover the fact that he'd mistaken my silence for permission for too long. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Nowhere," I said. "This is my home. You'll find another." He looked around, as if the walls were suddenly unfamiliar, as if the furniture, the art, even the scent of the room no longer belonged to him. They didn't. He stood there, folder in hand, as I rose from my chair, kissed my daughter's photo on the fridge, and walked out to tend to the garden. I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back. Because the power wasn't in the noise. The power was in the fact that I had already left the moment I decided I deserved peace. He just hadn't seen it until I handed him the evidence. Neatly labeled, perfectly timed, irreversible. He packed in silence. The man who once filled every room with his voice, his footsteps, his presence, now moved like a shadow. It was early morning, just after sunrise. The house was still dim, the windows fogged with the breath of another passing night. I sat at the dining table with my tea, listening to the soft clink of hangers, the rustle of duffel bags. I didn't interfere. I didn't ask where he was going. I didn't offer help. He didn't deserve a ceremony. When he came downstairs, 2 bags in hand, he paused by the doorway, unsure whether to say goodbye or simply disappear. He looked around the house one last time. His eyes lingered on the wall of family photos, the living room where we'd once danced, the space where he had taken everything for granted. "You sure this is what you want?" he asked, voice lower than I remembered it ever being. "Yes," I said without hesitation. He nodded slowly. "You'll regret this one day," he muttered. I raised my eyes to meet his. "I already regret staying as long as I did." That was the last thing I said to him. He stood there for a few seconds, waiting for more. A plea. A tear. A flicker of the woman who used to bend just to keep him happy. But I wasn't her anymore, and he knew it. He walked out, and with the click of the door behind him, I exhaled. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of space, of breath, of possibility. I walked from room to room like I was meeting my house for the first time. Every corner, every light switch, every drawer felt like mine again. Later that day, I took down the wedding photo from the hallway, not in anger, not in sadness, but in peace. I wrapped it gently, placed it in a box labeled past, and slid it into the attic. I didn't cry, because there was nothing left to mourn. The man who had left had been gone for years. This was just the physical proof of it. And now the real rebuilding could begin, on my terms. The house felt different, not quieter. It had always been quiet, especially in recent years, but lighter, as if some invisible weight had lifted from the floorboards, the walls, even the air. I walked barefoot from room to room that first night alone, and everything felt like mine again. The lamp, the throw blanket, the framed photograph of the kids on the mantel. I wasn't lonely. I was alone. And those two things I had learned were very, very different. I made dinner for one, pasta tossed in olive oil and fresh herbs from the garden. I lit a candle, not for romance, but for warmth. I poured a glass of wine and sat at the head of the table, not because I needed power, but because I finally had space. No questions, no lies, just me. There were moments, brief ones, where I felt the familiar pang of habit, like expecting his voice to come from the other room, or reaching to set out 2 plates instead of 1. But those instincts weren't grief. They were echoes. And echoes fade. I spent the evening doing things I used to postpone. I played music too loud. I rearranged bookshelves. I called my sister and spoke for over an hour without whispering. I danced while brushing my teeth. And later, as I curled into bed with fresh sheets and no expectations, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Safety. Not because someone was beside me, but because no one was. I slept with the window cracked open, the breeze drifting through gently. In the silence, I didn't wait for footsteps or excuses. I didn't check his phone. I didn't question my worth. I just slept. And when I woke, sunlight already warming the room, I didn't think of him. I thought of me. It started with a text, short, unexpected. "Can we talk?" I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't expect it eventually, but because I no longer cared to answer. He had been gone for weeks now, long enough to feel the absence, long enough to realize that what he thought was replaceable wasn't. The next day, there was a letter in the mailbox, handwritten, careful cursive, the way he used to sign birthday cards. Only this time, it wasn't wrapped in celebration. It was soaked in regret. I didn't know what I had. I didn't understand what I was doing. I never thought I'd lose you. And still, no real ownership, no apology for how he hurt me, only for the result of losing me. I didn't reply. A week later, I saw him from a distance, at the grocery store. He looked older, or maybe just smaller, the way guilt seems to fold a person inward. He walked past me without a word, then turned back. "You look happy," he said. I nodded. "I am." There was no bitterness in my voice, just truth, simple and whole. That truth unsettled him more than anger ever could have. "I'm sorry," he added quietly. "For all of it." I believed him. In that moment, I really did. But belief didn't mean I owed him anything. Closure didn't mean reunion. I said, "I hope you learn from it," and walked away. Because this story wasn't about his apology. It was about my freedom. The life I was building wasn't a reaction to his betrayal. It was a response to my rediscovered worth. And as I left the store, keys in hand, flowers in my basket, sunlight on my face, I realized something important. The pain he caused was part of my story, but it would never again be the center of it. It started slowly, a speaking engagement at the local women's center. Just a few chairs, a circle of strangers, and an invitation. "Tell us your story." At first, I hesitated, not because I was afraid, but because I hadn't said it out loud before, not fully, not without editing, not without softening the edges to make others more comfortable. But that night, I didn't soften. I told them the truth. I told them how a woman can disappear inside a marriage that looks perfect on the outside, how silence can become a habit, how betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a slow leak that drowns you drop by drop. I told them how I stayed, and then how I stopped. They didn't cry. They didn't gasp. They listened, really listened. And when I finished, something happened that I didn't expect. They applauded, not for my pain, but for my strength, my clarity, my survival. And that's when I realized I wasn't just free, I was useful. I started writing again, not in secret, not in shame. I wrote articles, essays, pieces of my journey for anyone who might be standing where I once stood, frozen, silent, scared to ask, is this love or just endurance? My voice, once tucked into corners, now carried across rooms. He saw one of my pieces by accident. A mutual friend had shared it online. I don't know if he read it. I don't need to know. Because the words weren't for him. They were for the woman I used to be, and the one still learning to speak. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. But I was clear. And clarity, I discovered, is the most powerful form of healing there is. After he left, the house changed. Not overnight, but in pieces. Small decisions, quiet reclaimings. I painted the hallway a soft terracotta, the color I'd always loved, but he once called too warm. I replaced the heavy curtains in the bedroom with sheer ones that let the morning light flood in. I donated half the furniture, the ones he chose while I stood beside him, pretending to care. The house became lighter, brighter, real. I planted herbs by the kitchen window, started keeping fresh flowers on the dining table, even if no one else would see them. I played music while I cooked, danced barefoot when I felt like it, and laughed out loud at books without worrying who might hear. The bedroom changed too. I moved the bed, bought new sheets, rearranged the art. There were no reminders of him, only space, for breathing, for dreaming, for existing without explanation. People came by more often, friends I had pushed away during those quiet years of pretending everything was fine. They sat on my new couch, sipped wine, told me they barely recognized me, but meant it in the best way. "You look alive again," one of them said. And I was. The house, once filled with tension and walking on eggshells, now held peace. Real peace, not the kind you pretend exists because confrontation feels too hard, but the kind you create when you've finally chosen yourself. One day, I opened a drawer in the hallway and found his watch. The one he used to leave behind all the time, always asking, "Have you seen it?" As if losing things made him charming. I held it in my hand for a moment. It was heavier than I remembered. I set it in a box and dropped it off at a donation center later that afternoon. Because I wasn't holding on to things anymore. Not the lies, not the memories, not even the leftovers of a man who once believed I'd never find life without him. I had, and now even the walls knew it. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single day when everything clicked into place, no moment of victory music playing in the background, just a slow, steady unfolding, like the quiet bloom of a flower that no longer needs permission to reach for the sun. I found work I loved, not just something to pay the bills, but something that filled me. I started teaching part-time at a community center, mentoring women who had been silenced in their own lives. They came in with broken voices and left with brighter eyes. One of them told me, "You make me believe it's possible." And I told her the truth. It is. But it starts with choosing yourself, even if no one else does. My children thrived. They didn't ask questions anymore. They didn't need to. They saw me now, the real me. Not the version I played to keep the peace. Not the worn-out woman begging for scraps of affection, but their mother, strong and present and whole. I traveled. Alone, at first, then with friends, then with no plan at all. I stood on cliffs and watched oceans move. I walked through cities where no one knew my name, and in those places, I wasn't anyone's wife or someone's second choice. I was simply me. There were moments when I remembered him. Not with longing, but with clarity. Moments that felt like watching someone else's life. A movie I'd seen too many times and finally walked out of before the credits rolled. Sometimes people asked me if I ever thought about dating again. I'd smile and say, maybe one day. But what I really meant was, I'm already in love. With this life, with this freedom, with this woman I fought so hard to become. And he? I don't know where he is now. I don't wonder. Because for the first time in years, my story doesn't circle back to him. It moves forward, with purpose, with peace, with me. I saw him again one afternoon, by chance, at a street fair of all places. I was browsing candles at a booth when I turned, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. Alone, older, thinner maybe, or just smaller. He recognized me instantly, but I felt nothing. No rush of memory, no ache in my chest, no anger, no bitterness, just the quiet realization that he had become exactly what he created. A man standing on the outside of a life he once believed he owned. He walked toward me, slow, uncertain. "You look good," he said. "Thank you," I replied, calm and kind, the way you speak to someone you've long since outgrown. There was a pause. I could feel him searching for something to hold on to, a thread, a spark, anything that might still tie us together. But there was nothing left. He was part of a chapter I had finished, part of a lesson I had learned. "I think about you sometimes," he said. I smiled. "I think about me too." And that was the difference. He spent his life chasing others, needing to be wanted, needing to be needed, while I had finally learned to belong to myself. Not in reaction to him, not in defiance, but in peace. We talked for a minute more, surface words, polite distance. Then I told him I had somewhere to be, which was true. I had plans, a full life, people waiting for me, a version of myself I loved enough to never abandon again. As I walked away, I didn't look back, because the truth is, he'll never fully understand what he lost. Not just a wife, not just a home, but a woman who loved him with everything until she finally learned to love herself more. And that, I've learned, is the ending that matters. Not the one he gave me, the one I gave myself.